Hello and welcome to Skynet Today's Let's Talk AI podcast, where you can hear from AI researchers about what's actually going on with AI and what's just clickbait headlines. This is our latest Last Week in AI episode, in which you get a quick digest of last week's AI news, as well as a bit of discussion between two researchers about what we think about this news. To start things off, we'll hand it off to Daniel Bashir to summarize what happened in AI last week, and we'll be back in just a few minutes to dive deeper into these stories and give our takes.
Hello, this is Daniel Bashir here with our weekly news summary. This week, we'll look at two stories on autonomous vehicles, a GPT-3 alternative, and Google search. We haven't heard many Apple car rumors over the past few months, but a recent story says the company has increased the number of self-driving cars and halved the number of drivers licensed to drive those cars. As 9to5Mac reports, Apple now has 68 self-driving test cars and 76 drivers. In March, Apple was granted a patent for a night vision system that combines visible light, near-infrared, and long-wave infrared sensors that would allow the Apple Car system to see 3 times farther at night than a human driver. Apple is reported to have discussed possible partnerships with a number of established car makers, including Hyundai, Nissan, and BMW. Our next story from the Robot Report concerns a particular ride YouTuber JJ Ricks, the most prolific documenter of Waymo 1 Level 4 robot taxis, took on May 3rd. When his robotaxi needed to make a right turn onto a multi-lane main road, it found the right lane closed off by orange construction cones. The confused vehicle couldn't figure out what to do and called for roadside assistance. But before that assistance arrived, the robotaxi pulled out onto the road, only to stop again, blocking traffic. It took off again 2 more times before the roadside assistance employee could actually get in the car, take over, and complete the ride. The confused vehicle shows that there's still many challenges to getting self-driving vehicles to a usable state. If you've been following the GPT-3 saga, you know that you can only access it through OpenAI's API, which is currently only available to those whose requests for use are approved. A while ago, a number of AI researchers and engineers founded Wav2Vec-U AI, a group working on open-source AI technology. Among its first endeavors has been creating an open-sourced GPT-like language model called GPT-Neo. The group uses idle compute on the TPU Research Cloud, a Google Cloud initiative that supports research projects with the expectation that the results of that research will be shared openly. This March, after months of research and training, the Wav2Vec-U AI team released 2 trained GPT-style language models that can be used for free with the Hugging Face Transformer platform. They don't perform nearly as well as the largest version of GPT-3 for some tasks, but prove to be a good free alternative. Finally, at its I/O Developer Conference last Tuesday, Google announced a number of ways it is moving forward with AI. As Vox reports, 2 of the biggest announcements are in the realm of natural language processing and search. LaMDA, which stands for Language Model for Dialogue Applications, makes it easy for AI systems to have more conversational dialogue. Multitask Unified Model, or MUM, is an AI model that boosts understanding of human questions and improves search. Google aims to have AI systems take on more of the work humans usually do. Rather than having to use multiple queries to answer a series of questions, you could use one more sophisticated question. Google is looking at integrating LaMDA into its search engine, voice assistant, and workspace. MUM, on the other hand, is designed to understand implicit comparisons in a search inquiry, like how to prepare for hiking 2 different mountains, and provide the most appropriate answer. That's all for this week's news roundup. Stay tuned for a more in-depth discussion of recent events.
Thanks, Daniel, and welcome back, listeners. Now that you've had a summary of last week's news, feel free to stick around for a more laid-back discussion about this news by 2 AI researchers. I'm Dr. Sharon Zhou, a graduating 4th-year PhD student in the machine learning group working with Andrew Ng. I do research on generative models and applying machine learning to medicine and climate. And with me is my co-host.
Hi there, I'm Andrei Krenkov, a 3rd-year PhD student at the Stanford Vision and Learning Lab. I focus mostly on learning algorithms for robotic manipulation and reinforcement learning. And if you're a regular listener, this week might be a bit interesting because we're changing things up a bit, unlike our usual kind of process of just talking about a few different news stories. Try to change it a bit by having sort of different flavors of stories every week and, a bit of each thing. So we're going to talk about AI news regarding research, AI news regarding applications of AI, and AI news that have to do more with sort of the societal impacts / ethics of AI. So hopefully it'll be fun to have a bit of each as opposed to sort of a random selection every week. So we're going to go ahead and start with applications or new AI research.
And to start things off, an article from VentureBeat titled GPT-3's free alternative GPT-Neo is something to be excited about. And so what is this GPT-Neo? So GPT-Neo is a GPT-3-like model, so huge language model that takes, a lot of resources to train, both money and time. And it was created by Wav2Vec-U AI, which is a team that was trying to, make or replicate GPT-3 in some sense and make it open source and accessible to everyone. And so they have succeeded in launching that. And the article basically details that, it has it has approximately the same amount of parameters, like billions of parameters, and it is out and open source, and you can use it. And what's cool is that the weights are released, so you don't actually need to expend a lot of that compute power anymore. And now we can, be greener as we move forward in the AI community, and hopefully just tap that API.
Exactly. And, there is actually a Hugging Face API, which is a popular library for this sort of model. So it's kind of very accessible to try this out. The only limitation, of course, is you need the hardware to run it, probably in some sort of cloud instance, which is not cheap. But otherwise, in terms of code, in terms of setting it up, it's much easier than it has been to do with scale of language model in the past. Now, I guess the limitation is that this is still not huge. It's 3 billion parameters as opposed to GPT-3's 170 billion or something. So it's a little more limited, but at the same time, on their metrics, they show that, it's performing pretty well, performing not quite as well as GPT-3, kind of across the board on the quantitative metrics. It's not as successful, but it still is performing impressively. And then qualitatively, what got people so excited about GPT-3 was its ability to do really coherent, well thought out completions. So, it can tell you a story about scientists discovering a unicorn. And the neat thing is, in this VentureBeat article, they include that from GPT-Neo, and it does a pretty good job. So I think quantitatively, qualitatively, this is definitely a step towards GPT-type technology being available to anyone and not just OpenAI. And furthermore, this group is already working on a larger scale GPT-Neo X, which is more like GPT-3. So I think for anyone who has hoped that, larger models would not just be proprietary to companies that develop them, this is a pretty good sign. And before we go on, maybe let me just read you a bit of this unicorn story that GPT-3 generated. So as a prompt, and this is a prompt that GPT-3 also had, there was this text: in a shocking finding, scientists discovered a herd of unicorns living in a remote, previously unexplored valley in the Andes Mountains. Even more surprising to the researchers was the fact that unicorns spoke perfect English. So starting from there, GPT-Neo completed as follows. The only evidence was a single word, hello. The unicorns are very good listeners, so we learned to speak English from watching humans, said Dr. David Orme, chief executive of the Zoological Society of London, in a press release. In fact, they also learned to speak Spanish from watching humans. They said hello to us in both languages. While the discovery is stunning in and of itself, the news gets even more mind-blowing when you consider that the unicorns were there for thousands of years. They were living fossils, Orm said, which is a fancy way of saying that their origins have yet to be determined. And so on. So it's, very grammatically correct, thematically consistent. It's not obvious if you haven't seen this sort of thing before that it's generated by AI. And it's very neat that, now this sort of thing is open sourced.
The only thing I really, really want is for it to have, instead of saying the only evidence was a single word, hello, like the language element of unicorns, like actually knowing that unicorns, like it's the horn part, that is odd, or that cues us in that it's a unicorn.
That's true. Yeah. As it is, it just treated unicorns as an arbitrary animal.
Yeah, and its specialty is that it can speak or learn human languages or something. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, on the topic of text, the next article is about both text and speech, and it's titled Facebook Wav2Vec-U learns to recognize speech from unlabeled data. And this article is also from VentureBeat. And so basically, Facebook announced today that it had, or recently, that it had trained an AI model that could do speech recognition without supervision. That is, without telling it that what this text, what this phrase actually was transcribed. And so that's a big step in the unsupervised speech recognition space in terms of its ability to learn that, because this means that it could leverage a lot more data, because a lot more data is not transcribed than is transcribed. There's a lot more speech data out there without transcriptions. So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I think in particular, this is cool because creating transcriptions of speech is pretty expensive. So, you've had ImageNet type data sets with millions of images for a while, but paying people to listen to audio and transcribe hours of it is much more difficult, or at least more costly and time consuming. So it's harder to scale. And most of these state-of-the-art models for languages like English use really, really huge data sets of, thousands of hours at least, if not more. And not only is that very expensive to make, but also, unlike a lot of other problems, there's not really many public data sets for speech recognition. There's a couple, but even those are pretty limited and much smaller than what these companies have internally. So yeah, I think even though this still won't outperform what we have commercialized, as a research project, it's pretty impressive, because it doesn't mean that for languages where you don't have huge data sets, or for companies that want to build something that don't have these data sets, this points to a new technique that can work really well while not requiring the same investment or the same initial starting data. And I think it's just also very neat. Like, this is not a problem where I've been aware of unsupervised learning. And in general, it seems like unintuitive, I suppose, that you can train a model to go from speech to text without having annotated speech with, the corresponding text. So personally, I thought this was pretty neat.
Yeah, I agree. And we looked at the paper. The architecture looks actually fairly simple, using a GAN. You guys are familiar with that. So yeah, it's not super complex, but hopefully will help with ASR systems, automatic speech recognition systems down the line, especially for, startups coming out that don't have as much data. And even for large companies that do have a lot of data, it could cut a lot of costs too.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess the other thing is, we have seen in recent years that self-supervised learning has really proven to be incredibly powerful with things like GPT, where you can just throw data at it without having labels associated with the data. And that could also be the case here, that, since you have so much more not annotated speech data and unrelated text data, this could actually be the way towards better performance ultimately if this technique can be scaled and worked upon in a similar way to what has happened with language models.
Right. And speaking of speech, I guess we're going to transition to our applications section of this conversation. And the next article is titled, "Deepfake Dubs Could Help Translate Film and TV Without Losing an Actor's Original Performance." And this article is by The Verge. And so the AI startup Flawless has come out with several demos showing that it can do dubbing. And specifically, it actually doesn't do the speech. So speech is still dubbed by another voice actor in another language, but they're able to do lip syncing with the mouth and make it so that it looks like, the dubber for, let's say, Tom Cruise's new movie can speak over him, but then his lips still match, let's say, the Spanish or the German dub. So that's really cool and exciting. And we'll see where that goes. Again, this is using a GAN. So those who are following, this is a visual thing. But of course, the article very much views it as, deepfake dubs for enabling this type of technology within entertainment. And I definitely can see it happening. It needs, a quality bump, I believe, but I could see it happening in the future for sure.
Yeah, I was pretty impressed by this. Just looking at their demos, I think it's already fairly, impressive, and it seems like something that is kind of a no-brainer that you'd want if you can do it with a reasonable amount of quality. It would just improve the final product when localizing into different countries. And looking over videos, I thought it was actually pretty good. Again, this only applies to the lips. It doesn't do the usual kind of deepfake of generating everything. And so as a result, I think being more focused on this one thing of how people speak, it already looks pretty realistic and pretty good. So, this is an application of kind of AI technology entertainment that I wasn't aware of until this article. But now that I've seen it, I would not be surprised if it became very commonplace very soon.
Right. Yeah.
But onto another application of AI that might be commonplace, maybe already is somewhat commonplace, but also more on the kind of fun side, not quite as serious or, maybe high investment. We have this article called "Quizzing Michelangelo AI" from the Florentine.net. So this is a very local story. This isn't like any sort of industry-wide story. It's just something fun we found related to AI. And so the story here is that tech company Coelho approached the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo with the idea of an artificial intelligence Michelangelo. So basically, the idea is now, museums had to invest in much more online presence, going on virtual tours and stuff like that over the last year. And so that was kind of the idea here, is that if you go to the Duomo Museum's website, there's going to be this Michelangelo AI that will pop up in the bottom right corner of the screen. And this is pretty much just a chatbot. So the idea is you can ask it things about Michelangelo's life, about the museum, and so on. Now, this is not the super advanced chatbot. It's mainly catered to specific questions. It can support up to like 7,000 of them, but still, I think it's pretty cute and kind of a fun thing, and a nice way to show that not everything with AI is high stakes. Sometimes you can just have something kind of more on the fun side.
It's cool that it's seeping into something like museums, which I feel like we think about museums as this, like, oh, it's about old and ancient relics. And then there's something so new about that. And of course, modern art museums are very different and there's new stuff in them all the time. But this is like, I don't know, very like we see it as bleeding edge technology. And it's cool that it's like it's so integrated with it already. And adds like a very artistic flair to a museum's website and an interactive aspect too.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting, actually, the article also says that this was sort of initially not what they wanted. So it says here, Domo, according to Coelho founder and CEO Francesco Rulli, initially did not accept the idea because it was too modern for them. But then when COVID-19 struck, they needed to modernize. And so now they, accepted the idea to try and modernize and accept more kind of technology, which it sounds like we sort of more traditional or more long-lasting museums haven't done as much of. It's fun. I actually just went to the website and started talking to Michelangelo AI, and it's not too sophisticated or anything, but at the same time, it is sort of fun. It tells you what do you want to ask, and then you can say something simple like when were you born, and it gives you a pretty detailed sort of life summary. Like, I was born on Monday, March 6, 1475. 4 hours before sunrise at Capris, not from Arezzo in Tuscany. And so, I don't know. This also makes me wonder if like we could have chatbots to ask about Wikipedia stories or something to just query for information instead of just looking it up ourselves.
I'm playing with it too. And it says, look at my self-portrait in my late Pieta. Do I look like a greedy and stingy person? And then I asked it, do you eat pizza? And he said, I had a spare and simple diet, often eating only a piece of bread. But when I lived in Rome, I had my brother send me from Florence cheese, oil, and other Tuscan products. I used to drink wine to get energy when I had to work hard. I did not have particularly refined taste. And then he sent me a picture of himself and said, do I look like a greedy and stingy? Dude, a selfie is really probably the oldest selfie I've ever seen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fun that it also kind of carries on a conversation. So after I asked it, it also prompted me with, do you know what is one of the most beloved buildings in Florence apart from the cathedral?
Yeah, it continues prompting you. That's cool.
Yeah, exactly.
Very cool.
Yeah, and I think it sort of speaks to, I think some art museums sometimes can be a little intimidating or maybe less fun, very, very serious, self-serious, right? And this does sort of say or indicate that maybe it would be a nice idea to make the experience of appreciating art also more fun and interactive and, appeal to the kids that way and so on.
Yes. It does get appealing to the kids. Or maybe AI researchers, God knows, or if there's a difference, I'm not sure.
Alrighty, so that's fun. You can look it up if you want to play around with that chatbot. And that we're going to move on to our last little segment, which is more discussing not just applications, but sort of societal implications of AI and recent news stories that are more maybe serious in some sense. Starting with our first one, which is not really a news story. It's a Medium post by Black Lemoyne about the history of ethical AI at Google. So it starts with saying that this person has had the privilege of being at Google for 6 years now. And this post explains from this person's perspective how the ethical AI team was created by one woman over the course of 4 years. And that one woman is Margaret Mitchell. And this is not an overly detailed, like a 10-minute read that basically traces the creation of the ethical AI team, and in particular sort of details the impact that Margaret Mitchell and Timnit Gebru had on it. And of course, the reason this is being written, if you haven't been listening to a podcast, because we've discussed a lot, there's been a lot of news in the past year about first Timnit Gebru being fired from Google, and then Margaret Mitchell being fired just a few months ago. And now there's a lot of negative feelings and criticism and general ill will towards the ethical, or Google, I should say, Google, for basically firing the two people who really built up the ethical AI team, and seemingly not having a very good justification for it. So I found this to be an interesting read, sort of this summary that's really meant to give credit to Margaret Mitchell and Timnit Gebru and kind of make their contributions very clear, partially because, of course, Google now will not be their cheerleader. There'll be probably some history or some efforts to kind of paint over that history and move on. And that's unfortunate. So it's good that people still exist to be able to tell of their contribution. What do you think about this one, Sharon?
Yeah, I mean, it's really meaningful that all these people have come out to not only just support, but also, write something like this and actually put the effort in. Like, there is a lot of effort in writing this large blog post. So I think it speaks to who Meg was as a person, and just, how important she was for a lot of people at Google. Definitely a role model for aspiring managers. If people who report to you or feel inspired by you this much, it means something. So I hope she knows that, at least. And yes to the, Google will probably want to paint over it in some way. They want to move on. They want to say that they're still doing ethics, but in their own way. I think it's a very different thing now, in how everything is culminated.
Yeah, exactly. And this post does conclude with kind of reflection on the state of a team now. And it ends on a somewhat positive note. It says that hopefully ethical AI may someday again be as robust at Google as what it was. Unfortunately, today we are bleeding minds because the best of the best no longer trust Google leadership to make right decisions. And I've had multiple conversations with other ethical AI researchers and engineers about whether or not to quit. Many have considered it. And then it goes on to say that those who are staying are there to make sure that all the work that Margaret Mitchell did will not be for nothing. And then, so they're staying to be at Google to do the work, to build on, Margaret Mitchell's legacy of having built up the team. And, it says that hopefully the connections and expertise built over the past 4 years is sufficiently robust to weather this storm, which is, I think, a nice message to send at this point. Obviously, I think for many people, especially in ethical AI, this whole thing was pretty shocking. I mean, it's really, you don't see these sorts of very high profile, firings of real leading experts in AI. And so this was really a huge deal. And it's nice to see that people are sort of looking forward as well and saying that, we can rebuild and keep going despite what's happening.
Right. And on the topic of, ethics and just societal impact of AI, our last article is from the Twitter blog titled "Sharing Learnings About Our Image Cropping Algorithm." And this was in light of a lot of activity on Twitter about how the automatic cropping algorithm of images. So like you post an image, but it's too big to look at, and Twitter automatically crops it, finds the best place to crop it with their AI algorithm, and then has people look at that through the feed. But what people found was, there's some controversy, right? Because it's like, oh, why would they always crop this person versus that person? And so Twitter actually did a study and found that between men and women, there was an 8% difference from demographic parity in favor of women. Comparing Black and white individuals, there was a 4% difference in favor of white individuals. And looking at comparisons between Black and white women, there was a 7% difference in favor of white women. And finally, Black and white men, there's a 2% difference in favor of white men. So there are clear leanings. The percentages are, of course, small, but that still in absolute terms does mean a decent amount of images on Twitter. And Twitter now has launched a feature that basically is just like saying, hey, we will let you as a user control where to crop. So you can still decide, and we won't necessarily force it to be one way or another. And I remember talking to someone and they said, why wasn't this the original thing? Like, why do we have to go in circles for this to be it? But I think it's that it felt like it would be simpler if the user didn't have to see controls or something like that. But yeah, I'm glad Twitter reacted well to the discussions on their platform and did some studies with data and have improved the experience.
Yeah, exactly. I think just about everyone that I've seen react to us on Twitter about this blog post likewise said that, it's really commendable how they approached this in terms of there was controversy about it. At the time in last October, people were posting, basically experimenting and showing that under some conditions it would crop to show, a white person instead of Obama or things like that. And at that point, it was all very sort of ad hoc. It wasn't really a study per se, but they took those concerns in mind and did this proper study and found results and concluded and changed the service. And I agree that, probably they did that originally, use this machine learning thing to make posting quicker, to, not force people to worry about cropping, to make sure that all the photos are of the same size. But it is commendable that they went back on a decision, figured out that in some cases it's good to just not have an algorithm make any decisions or make the decisions and allow the person to be in control. Yeah, kind of like a feel-good story, really, for AI, and a good example of what a good ethical AI team within a company should be able to do, right? So nice way to end this episode, I suppose, with a pretty positive outcome.
Oh yeah, we love that. And with that, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Skynet Today's Let's Talk AI podcast. You can find the articles we discussed here today and subscribe to our weekly newsletter with similar ones at skynettoday.com.
Subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to leave us a rating and a review if you like the show.
Be sure to tune in next week.
All right.
Woo!